how it all began. I still remember the day we met, not because it was special, but because it was painfully ordinary. It was 1967, a time when I wasn't thinking about destiny, lifelong friendships, or the idea that some people quietly shape your entire life. I was young, focused on getting through the day, earning a living, and making sure tomorrow didn't collapse on me. If someone had told me that morning that I was about to meet my best friend of the next 57 years, I would have laughed and kept walking. The place itself was nothing worth remembering. No music playing, no dramatic moment, no feeling that something important was about to happen. Just machines humming in the background, the smell of paper and ink in the air, and people moving through their routines like they always did. It was the kind of place you forget the moment you leave, the kind of day that blends into every other day when you look back decades later. He was just another face among many. A man doing his job, focused, quiet, not trying to impress anyone. We exchanged a few words, nothing meaningful, nothing memorable. No spark. No instant connection. Just polite conversation between two people who happened to cross paths. At that moment, he meant no more to me than anyone else I spoke to that week. Looking back now, that's the part that stays with me the most. Not the conversation, not the details, but the absence of significance. Life rarely announces its most important moments. The people who end up meaning everything often enter quietly, without warning, without drama, while you're busy thinking about completely different things. At 80 years old, I've learned that beginnings are almost always invisible. You don't recognize them when they happen. You only see them clearly decades later, when the story is already complete. That day in 1967 wasn't special, but it became the foundation of a friendship that outlived careers, seasons, and most of the people we once knew. No big plans, just life. Back then, neither of us was thinking about long-term friendships or the idea of growing old together. We were too busy dealing with the weight of everyday life. Bills had to be paid, work had to be done, and the future felt less like a dream and more like something we were simply trying to survive. Friendship, at that stage, wasn't something we searched for, it was something that happened quietly in the background. Our conversations were simple and practical. We talked about work, about how tired we were, about things that annoyed us and things that barely mattered. There were no deep confessions, no emotional speeches, no sense that we were building something important. We were just two men sharing time in the same space, unaware that consistency itself was doing the real work. Days turned into weeks, and weeks quietly turned into years. Without any decision being made, we started choosing the same routines, arriving around the same time, sitting in the same places, walking the same paths home. Familiarity grew not from effort, but from repetition, from showing up again and again without thinking about it. Neither of us ever said, "We're best friends." That label came much later. Back then, he was simply the person I expected to see, the one face that felt steady in days that often felt unpredictable. There was comfort in that, even if we didn't have the language to describe it yet. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see at the time. The strongest relationships are rarely built on big moments or dramatic beginnings. They're built on ordinary days, shared silence, and the unspoken agreement to keep showing up, even when nothing exciting is happening. If you had asked me then where life was going, I wouldn't have had an answer. But somehow, in the middle of all that uncertainty, a friendship was quietly taking shape, without plans, without promises, and without either of us realizing how much it would one day mean. Growing side by side. Somewhere along the way, life stopped feeling like a series of separate days and started to feel like a long, continuous stretch of time. Without ever talking about it, we began to move through life side by side. Careers changed, responsibilities grew heavier, and the world around us kept shifting, but our presence in each other's lives remained steady. We shared more than conversations. We shared exhaustion after long days, quiet satisfaction after small successes, and disappointment when things didn't work out the way we hoped. Some days we talked for hours. Other days, we barely spoke at all. But silence never felt uncomfortable, it felt understood. Life wasn't kind all the time. There were moments of failure, moments when money was tight, moments when the future felt uncertain. In those times, we didn't offer grand advice or motivational speeches. We offered presence. Sometimes that meant listening. Sometimes it meant distraction. Sometimes it just meant being there so the other person didn't feel alone. Years passed, and our lives filled with routines that overlapped naturally. Family obligations, work schedules, and responsibilities pulled us in different directions, yet we always found our way back into each other's orbit. The friendship adapted, matured, and deepened without ever demanding attention. Looking back now, I realize that growing together doesn't mean growing in the same direction. It means allowing space for change while choosing not to drift apart. We became different people over time, shaped by different experiences, but the connection remained intact. At 80 years old, I understand this clearly: the deepest bonds are formed not through intensity, but through endurance. Through years of shared life, quiet loyalty, and the simple decision, made over and over again, to stay. Not always perfect. Friendship, especially one that lasts decades, is never smooth the entire way through. We disagreed more times than I can count. Sometimes about work, sometimes about money, sometimes about choices we didn't understand in each other. There were moments when pride got in the way, when words were sharper than they needed to be, and silence lasted longer than it should have. There were arguments that started over small things and somehow turned into something heavier. Not because the issue mattered, but because life itself was heavy at times. Stress has a way of leaking into relationships, even the strongest ones. We didn't always handle those moments well, and we didn't always apologize as quickly as we should have. But something important always happened after the distance. Neither of us ever truly walked away. Days or weeks later, one of us would call, or show up, or say something simple that reopened the door. No dramatic reconciliation. No speeches. Just a quiet understanding that the bond mattered more than being right. Over time, we learned each other's limits. We learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. We learned that disagreements didn't mean disloyalty, and that conflict didn't cancel history. In fact, it was often the ability to survive disagreement that made the friendship stronger. Looking back now, I see that perfection was never the goal. Endurance was. The willingness to return after tension, to choose understanding over ego, and to accept each other as flawed human beings trying their best in a complicated world. At 80 years old, this is clear to me: relationships don't last because there are no conflicts. They last because the connection is stronger than the conflicts, and because both people decide, again and again, not to let temporary distance become permanent. The illusion of always. After so many years, his presence stopped feeling like something special and started feeling like something permanent. He was simply there, in my phone contacts, in my routines, in the background of my life. I didn't question it. I didn't think about it. I just assumed that after decades of friendship, some things no longer needed attention. That's how familiarity works. It slowly turns gratitude into expectation. Not because we stop caring, but because we stop imagining the alternative. I never woke up thinking, what if this is the last year we talk? I woke up thinking there would always be another conversation, another visit, another chance. We spoke often, but not deeply. We checked in, but we didn't linger. Life was busy, and there was always something to do, somewhere to be, some responsibility waiting. Important words were postponed, not because they didn't matter, but because they felt safe to delay. I believed time was generous. I believed it would wait for me to slow down. After all, we had already made it through so much together. Careers, families, losses, changes. I mistook survival for permanence, forgetting that nothing living is guaranteed to stay. Looking back now, this is the moment I wish I could return to, not to change something dramatic, but to pay closer attention. To listen longer. To say more. To treat his presence not as a constant, but as the fragile gift that it was. At 80 years old, I understand this painfully well. The people who feel permanent are often the ones we take for granted the most. Not out of neglect, but out of trust. And sometimes, that trust costs us the chance to say what truly matters. When everything ends quietly. When he passed away, there was no dramatic moment that marked the end. No final speech. No last deep conversation where everything suddenly made sense. Life didn't slow down or pause to acknowledge what had happened. It simply continued, indifferent, while something permanent disappeared from my world. I received the news in the most ordinary way. A phone call. A few words spoken carefully. Silence afterward. I remember holding the phone, waiting for something else to be said, as if the story couldn't possibly end with that sentence alone. But it did. What struck me most was how unprepared I was. After 57 years of knowing someone, you think you'd be ready. You think your mind would know how to react. But nothing prepares you for the moment when a presence that shaped your life is suddenly reduced to memory. There was no chance to clean up old conversations. No opportunity to say the things that had waited too long. No final thank you spoken out loud. The ending was not cruel, it was simply unfinished, and that made it harder to accept. In the days that followed, I noticed how absence announces itself. In the habits that no longer make sense. In moments when you instinctively reach for the phone, only to remember there's no one on the other end anymore. Loss doesn't arrive loudly, it settles in quietly and stays. At 80 years old, I've learned that endings rarely come with closure. Most of the time, they come mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-life. And all you're left with is the responsibility of carrying what was never fully said. The real pain. People often think the pain comes from the moment someone dies. It doesn't. The real pain arrives later, quietly, when the noise is gone and life expects you to keep moving as if nothing fundamental has changed. That's when the weight settles in, slow and heavy, with no clear place to put it. What hurt the most wasn't losing him, it was realizing how much I had postponed. Conversations I meant to have. Words I assumed didn't need to be said anymore. Gratitude that lived comfortably in my head but rarely made it out of my mouth. I replayed moments in my mind, searching for missed opportunities. Times when I could have stayed on the phone a little longer. Visits I delayed because I was tired or busy. Small decisions that felt harmless at the time, but now carried more weight than I ever imagined. Regret is a strange thing. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It waits for quiet moments and then reminds you of everything you thought you had time for. And the hardest part is knowing that none of it can be fixed. There is no apology that reaches the past. I realized something uncomfortable: love doesn't always express itself through urgency. Sometimes it hides behind routine. Behind the belief that understanding doesn't need to be spoken. But understanding unspoken is still understanding unseen. At 80 years old, this is the truth I carry with me now: the pain of loss is heavy, but the pain of unsaid words is heavier. Because grief fades with time, but unfinished sentences echo forever. What I learned at 80. After the pain softened, something else slowly took its place. Not peace, not acceptance, but clarity. The kind that only comes when there's nothing left to change. I began to see my life, and our friendship, without urgency, without denial, just as it truly was. I learned that time is not cruel, it's honest. It never promised us later. That was something we invented to make ourselves comfortable. Time only ever offers now, and once it passes, it doesn't negotiate, it doesn't return calls, and it doesn't explain itself. I also learned that love doesn't need to be dramatic to be real, but it does need to be expressed. Presence matters. Words matter. Saying "I appreciate you" matters more than we like to admit, especially when we assume the other person already knows. If you're younger than me, you still have something I don't: options. You can choose to make the call. You can choose to stay a little longer. You can choose not to rush past the people who quietly make your life feel stable. Don't wait for the right moment. It rarely arrives on schedule. Speak while you can. Show up while it still matters. Treat the people you trust not as permanent fixtures, but as gifts with unknown expiration dates. At 80 years old, this is the lesson I leave you with: one day, memories will be all that remain. Make sure they're not weighed down by sentences that were never spoken. Say what matters, while your voice can still be heard.